A new beginning, a chilling reality. Dr. Simone Everett stood at the glass doors of Vanguard Medical Center, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. This was her dream, her first day as a surgical resident at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the region. The white coat she wore felt heavy, not just because of the fabric, but because of the weight of expectation she carried. Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag as she adjusted her posture. She was ready for this. She had worked tirelessly to be here, overcoming challenges that would have broken others. Stepping through the doors, the hum of the hospital greeted her. Nurses rushed down the halls. Monitors beeped in the distance, and the faint aroma of antiseptics lingered in the air. Simone took a deep breath, allowing the moment to settle. She was here. She belonged. Her first stop was the office of Dr. Victor Halstead, the senior surgeon who would oversee her residency. His reputation preceded him. A genius in the operating room, but with a personality that sent chills down the spines of even the most confident residents. Simone had spent hours preparing for this meeting, replaying scenarios in her mind. Would he be welcoming? Dismissive? She knocked on the door, her knuckles echoing against the wood. "Come in," a gruff voice called. Simone stepped inside. Dr. Halstead stood by his desk, flipping through a file. He was a tall man, his white coat crisp, his eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses. He glanced up, giving her a quick once-over before returning to his file. "Dr. Everett," he said without looking up again. "Welcome to Vanguard Medical." "Thank you, Dr. Halstead. I'm looking forward to learning under your guidance," she replied, her tone measured. "Residency here is rigorous." He cut her off, finally looking at her. His expression was flat, unreadable. "Many don't make it past the first 6 months. We demand excellence, nothing less." Simone nodded. "Understood, sir." He handed her a file without further acknowledgement. "Your schedule. Be punctual. I have no tolerance for tardiness or excuses." Simone accepted the file, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the folder. Without another word, Dr. Halstead gestured for her to follow. As they walked through the hospital, he pointed out various departments, speaking in a clipped tone that allowed no room for questions. Simone followed silently, absorbing every word, every detail. When they arrived at the surgical ward, 2 other new residents were waiting. A young man with a confident smirk and a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority. Dr. Halstead greeted them with a warmth he hadn't extended to Simone, even cracking a rare smile as he welcomed them to the team. "This is Dr. Everett," he said, his tone dropping back to its curt edge. "She'll be joining us as well." The other residents exchanged polite nods with Simone, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle difference in their interactions. Dr. Halstead's voice carried respect when he spoke to them. With her, it was purely transactional. The morning was a blur of patient evaluations and quick instructions. Simone worked meticulously, ensuring every detail was accurate. But no matter how hard she tried, Dr. Halstead's feedback was always the same: a curt fine before he moved on. The other residents received praise for even minor tasks, their mistakes brushed off with a chuckle and encouragement to improve. Simone, however, was treated with cold efficiency, as if her presence was tolerated but not welcomed. By lunchtime, Simone's stomach growled, but the tension in her chest pushed her to skip the cafeteria. She walked the halls instead, hoping to familiarize herself with the hospital's layout. As she passed by the cafeteria, hushed voices caught her attention. "Did you see the new resident in surgery?" a nurse whispered. "The diversity hire." Another replied with a smirk. "Yeah, I saw her. Let's see how long she lasts." Simone froze, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep walking. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You worked hard for this. Don't let anyone make you doubt it." After a quick lunch in solitude, Simone returned to the ward. Dr. Halstead handed her another chart without so much as a glance. "Room 216. Standard intake. Yes, sir, she replied, masking her frustration. The afternoon passed much like the morning. Routine tasks, minimal interaction, and an unshakable sense that she was being excluded from meaningful opportunities. While the other residents were assigned cases that challenged their skills, Simone was relegated to basic responsibilities, as if she hadn't spent years preparing for this moment. By the end of the day, Simone's exhaustion was more emotional than physical. As she walked toward the exit, she overheard a group of nurses chatting in low voices. 3 months, one of them said, laughing softly. That's my bet. Simone didn't need to ask what they were talking about. She squared her shoulders, forcing herself to breathe deeply. She wouldn't let their doubts seep into her mind. She had faced worse and emerged stronger. Stepping out into the cool evening air, Simone paused. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to her mother's contact. Her mother's voice was the grounding force she needed, the reminder that she was capable, deserving, and resilient. Simone, baby. Her mother's warm voice greeted her after the first ring. How was your first day? Simone hesitated, the weight of the day pressing against her chest. It was tough, Mom. I'm not sure if I'll ever fit in here. Her mother's voice softened. Fitting in isn't why you're there, sweetheart. You're there to excel, to show them what you're made of. Simone closed her eyes, letting her mother's words wash over her. But it feels like they're waiting for me to fail. Let them wait, her mother said firmly. You're not here for their approval. You're here to be the best surgeon you can be. And you will be. Just take it one day at a time. Simone smiled, a flicker of hope reigniting in her chest. Thanks, Mom. I needed that. Anytime, baby. Now go show them who you are. With renewed determination, Simone ended the call and turned back toward the hospital. She wasn't here to make friends or seek validation. She was here to prove, most of all to herself, that she belonged. Tomorrow would be another battle, but she was ready. As the night deepened, she made a silent promise. She would rise above every challenge, every doubt, and every whisper. She would succeed, not because they believed in her, but because she believed in herself. The heat of scrutiny. Simone Everett arrived at Vanguard Medical Center the next morning with a renewed sense of determination. The words of her mother the night before rang in her ears as she donned her white coat and tied her scrubs. You're not here for their approval. You're here to excel. It was easier said than done, but Simone had never been one to back down from a challenge. The surgical floor was already alive with activity. Nurses wheeled patients into recovery rooms, and residents huddled in small groups over charts, discussing cases with animated gestures. Simone walked in with her head held high, determined to shake off the isolation of the previous day. She spotted Dr. Victor Halstead standing at the nurse's station, flipping through a file. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but his eyes narrowed slightly when they landed on Simone. Dr. Everett, he said without preamble, handing her a thick folder. You'll be assisting with Mr. Whittaker's post-operative care. His vitals need monitoring every hour. Make sure nothing is missed. Yes, Dr. Halstead, Simone replied, keeping her tone neutral. As he walked away, Simone flipped open the file. Mr. Whittaker was a high-risk cardiac patient recovering from bypass surgery. His case was complex, but not particularly challenging for someone like Simone, who had spent years honing her skills in intensive patient care during medical school rotations. She knew the assignment wasn't given to her as a chance to shine. It was yet another task designed to keep her occupied and out of sight. She wouldn't let it discourage her. By mid-morning, Simone was deeply engrossed in Mr. Whittaker's care. She meticulously checked his vitals, recorded every detail, and even went out of her way to double-check his medication schedule with the pharmacy. As she adjusted his IV, the patient stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Who are you? His voice was hoarse, his eyes squinting against the harsh light of the hospital room. I'm Dr. Everett, Mr. Whittaker, Simone said gently. I'm one of the residents on your care team. How are you feeling? Like I got run over by a truck, he muttered, his lips curling into a faint smile. But I guess that's better than being 6 feet under. Simone chuckled softly, appreciating his attempt at humor. You're on the road to recovery, Mr. Whittaker. We're keeping a close eye on you. He studied her for a moment, his expression softening. You're young, he said, his voice tinged with surprise. But you seem capable. Simone smiled. Thank you. My job is to make sure you get the best care possible. Mr. Whittaker gave a slow nod. Good. I'll hold you to that. As she left his room, Simone felt a small spark of pride. It was the first genuine interaction she'd had since starting at Vanguard, and it reminded her why she had chosen this path. But the moment of peace didn't last long. The surgical floor buzzed as the morning meeting began. Residents gathered around Dr. Halstead as he reviewed the day's schedule, assigning cases with his usual air of authority. Simone listened intently, hoping to be given an opportunity to prove herself. Dr. Chen, he said, handing a chart to the sharp-eyed woman Simone had met the day before. You'll assist with a complex gallbladder removal. It's a good chance to refine your technique. Dr. Chen nodded, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. Dr. Everett, Halstead said next, his tone notably cooler. He handed her a chart without looking at her. Routine evaluation on Mrs. Blake in room 312. Nothing complicated. Simone's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. Understood, Dr. Halstead. She could feel the weight of the other residents' eyes on her. A few exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from pity to amusement. Simone ignored them, clutching the chart tightly as she headed toward Mrs. Blake's room. As the day wore on, Simone's frustration grew. Every task she was assigned seemed deliberately chosen to sideline her, while her peers were given cases that allowed them to showcase their skills. She worked in silence, her mind racing with questions she couldn't voice. Was it her gender, her race, or was she simply imagining it all? By the time lunch rolled around, Simone decided to break the monotony. She headed to the cafeteria, determined to engage with her fellow residents. She spotted Dr. Chen and Dr. Matthews sitting at a table near the window. Summoning her courage, she approached them. Mind if I join you? She asked, keeping her tone light. Dr. Matthews glanced up, a polite smile on his face. Sure. But no sooner had Simone taken a seat than Dr. Chen glanced at her watch and stood. Actually, I need to prep for the afternoon, she said, her tone abrupt. Catch you later. Dr. Matthews hesitated for a moment, then followed suit. Yeah, same here. Sorry, Dr. Everett. Someone watched them walk away, her chest tightening. She sat alone, pushing her food around her plate, the weight of isolation pressing down on her. Later that afternoon, Simone encountered Evelyn and Lila, 2 nurses she'd noticed in the cafeteria the day before. Evelyn was tall and confident, with her curly hair pulled into a bun, while Lila was quieter, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Dr. Everett, Evelyn said, nodding in greeting. Hi, Simone replied, grateful for the acknowledgement. I'm new here, still finding my footing. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Lila before speaking. You've got your work cut out for you. Vanguard has its ways. Lila sighed, her voice low. Especially with Dr. Halstead around. He's known for being tough, but some say he's got a bias against residents who don't fit his mold. Simone's stomach sank. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was both validating and disheartening. I thought maybe I just needed to adjust, she admitted. It's not you, Evelyn said firmly. But if you want to survive here, you'll need to watch your back. And don't give him an excuse to doubt you. Thanks, Simone said quietly. I appreciate the heads up. Evelyn gave her a small pat on the shoulder. You've got potential, Dr. Everett. Don't let him take that from you. The day ended with another mountain of paperwork. Simone sat alone at her station, meticulously updating patient records. Dr. Halstead passed by once, his eyes scanning her work without a word before moving on. It was a small mercy. She didn't have the energy for another confrontation. As the clock struck 8, Simone finally packed up her things and headed toward the exit. She spotted Evelyn and Lila chatting near the nurse's station. Evelyn gave her a small nod of encouragement as she passed, and for the first time all day, Simone felt a flicker of solidarity. Outside, the cool evening air wrapped around her like a balm. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to her mother's contact. But this time, she hesitated. Instead of calling, she stared at the glowing screen. The words were stronger than this looping in her mind. Simone slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't need to hear it tonight. She already knew it. Tomorrow was a new day, and she'd face it the only way she knew how, with quiet determination and an unshakable resolve to prove that she belonged. The breaking point. Simone Everett's third day at Vanguard Medical Center began with the same relentless pace as the two before it. She arrived on the surgical floor before sunrise, determined to get ahead of the day's assignments. As she reviewed patient files, she overheard laughter from the nurse's station. Glancing up, she spotted Dr. Matthews and Dr. Chen chatting animatedly with Dr. Halstead. The senior surgeon was smiling, a rare sight, and Simone couldn't help but notice the camaraderie between them. It was a stark contrast to how he interacted with her. Simone focused on her notes, determined to tune out the scene. She wouldn't let herself be distracted by feelings of exclusion. She was here to work, not to make friends. Yet, as she flipped through her files, her mind wandered to the mounting frustration she'd felt over the past 2 days. Every assignment seemed carefully chosen to keep her from excelling. Every glance from her peers carried a subtle judgment. Every word from Dr. Halstead dripped with condescension. She clenched her pen tighter, forcing herself to push through the rising tide of doubt. The morning briefing brought another wave of frustration. "Dr. Matthews," Halstead began, handing him a file. "You'll be assisting me with a laparoscopic liver resection. It's a challenging case, but I believe you're up to the task." Simone suppressed a sigh as she watched Matthews nod, his confidence radiating from every fiber of his being. "Dr. Chen," Halstead continued, "you'll handle the post-operative care for Mr. Grant. Monitor his vitals closely and adjust his medication as needed. We need to ensure he's ready for discharge by tomorrow." Then, without even looking in Simone's direction, Halstead thrust a file into her hands. "Routine vitals check on Mrs. Lin. Room 305. Simone's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone neutral. "Understood, Dr. Halstead." As the residents dispersed, Dr. Matthews shot her a sympathetic glance, but it was fleeting. She caught him whispering something to Dr. Chen as they walked away, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Simone squared her shoulders and headed toward Mrs. Lin's room, determined not to let their dismissiveness get to her. Mrs. Lin was an elderly woman recovering from hip replacement surgery. Simone conducted the vitals check with precision, making small talk to put the patient at ease. "You're very thorough, Doctor," Mrs. Lin said with a smile, her frail fingers gripping Simone's hand briefly. "I appreciate that." Simone returned the smile, grateful for the rare moment of appreciation. "It's my job to make sure you're well taken care of, Mrs. Lin." As she left the room, Simone felt a flicker of pride. Moments like these reminded her why she had chosen this path. But the feeling was short-lived. She stepped into the hallway just in time to hear 2 nurses whispering nearby. "She's trying so hard," one of them said, her tone dripping with mockery. "I give her another month," the other replied. Simone froze, her chest tightening. She wanted to confront them, to demand why they were so quick to judge her, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she walked away, her fists clenched at her sides. The afternoon brought a glimmer of hope when Simone was assigned to assist Dr. Halstead with an incoming trauma case. It was the first time she'd been given a task that required critical thinking and hands-on skills. She rushed to the trauma bay, adrenaline surging through her veins. The patient was a middle-aged man who had been in a car accident. He had multiple fractures and a punctured lung, and the team needed to stabilize him before surgery. Simone worked quickly, monitoring his vitals and assisting with the insertion of a chest tube. "Dr. Everett," Halstead barked. "Suction." Simone handed him the suction device without hesitation, her movements precise. She could feel his eyes on her, scrutinizing every action, waiting for her to falter. But she didn't. She stayed focused, her training kicking in as she anticipated his next move. For a moment, it seemed like she had finally earned a sliver of his respect. But then, as the patient was wheeled off to the operating room, Halstead turned to her, his expression cold. "You hesitated when I asked for the suction," he said, his tone sharp. "In trauma cases, every second counts. Do better." Simone opened her mouth to respond, to explain that she hadn't hesitated at all. But the words caught in her throat. She watched as he walked away, leaving her standing there with a lump in her chest. By the end of the day, Simone was exhausted. She sat alone in the residence lounge, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. The weight of the past 3 days pressed down on her like a physical force. She had always known residency would be tough, but this was something else entirely. Her thoughts were interrupted when Evelyn, the nurse she'd met earlier, walked in. She carried 2 cups of coffee, setting one down in front of Simone without a word. "Long day?" Evelyn asked, taking the seat across from her. Simone managed a small smile. "That obvious?" Evelyn chuckled softly. "It's written all over your face." Simone hesitated, then decided to open up. "It feels like, no matter what I do, it's not enough. Dr. Halstead is watching my every move, just waiting for me to make a mistake. And the other residents," she trailed off, shaking her head. "They're taking their cues from him." Evelyn finished for her. Simone nodded, grateful for the understanding. Evelyn leaned forward, her expression serious. "You're not imagining it. Dr. Everett, Halstead has a history of targeting residents who don't fit his mold. You're not the first." Simone's stomach sank. Then why is he still here? Why hasn't anyone said anything? "Because he's good at what he does," Evelyn replied. "And because people like him have a way of making others doubt themselves. But you don't have to let him win." Simone looked down at her coffee, her mind racing. What if I can't keep up? What if I don't have what it takes? Evelyn reached across the table, placing a hand over Simone's. "You wouldn't be here if you didn't. Don't let him or anyone else make you forget that." Simone left the hospital that night with Evelyn's words echoing in her mind. She stared up at the towering building, its lights illuminating the dark sky. For the first time in 3 days, she felt a spark of defiance. She wasn't going to let Dr. Halstead or anyone else push her out. She had worked too hard to get here. Tomorrow, she would return stronger, sharper, and more determined than ever. Simone straightened her shoulders and walked toward her car, her resolve solidifying with every step. She would prove them all wrong, not for their approval, but for herself. A test of resolve. The 4th day of residency at Vanguard Medical Center began like any other for Dr. Simone Everett. An early morning arrival, a quiet review of patient files, and a constant, heavy presence of judgment hanging in the air. But today felt different. The tension in the hospital was palpable, as if an unspoken challenge was looming. Simone brushed it aside as nerves. She had resolved to focus solely on her work, no matter how much resistance she faced. Her determination would soon be tested. During the morning briefing, Dr. Halstead's tone carried an edge that made the other residents sit up a little straighter. The senior surgeon was in an unusually foul mood, though it wasn't clear why. Simone suspected it had something to do with the board of directors' unannounced inspection of the hospital the day before, a reminder that even people like Halstead had to answer to someone. "Dr. Matthews," Halstead barked, handing him a thick file. "You'll assist me on a complex spinal surgery this afternoon. It'll be an excellent opportunity to hone your technique." Matthews nodded, his confidence unwavering. Simone watched as Halstead moved down the line, doling out assignments to Dr. Chen and the others, each task carefully chosen to showcase their strengths. When he reached Simone, his gaze lingered on her for a fraction too long, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Dr. Everett," he said at last, holding out a chart. "You'll handle the intake for Mrs. Morales, a newly admitted patient in room 215. It's a straightforward case. Vitals, history, and a basic assessment." Simone felt the familiar sting of disappointment, but kept her expression neutral. "Understood, Dr. Halstead." As she walked away, she heard the faint snickers of her peers behind her. Her grip on the file tightened, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't afford to let them see how much it hurt. Mrs. Morales was a middle-aged woman with severe abdominal pain that had persisted for days. Simone reviewed her chart carefully before entering the room, noting the possibility of appendicitis or gallbladder inflammation. She greeted the patient with a warm smile, her professionalism unwavering. "Good morning, Mrs. Morales. I'm Dr. Everett, one of the residents on your care team. I'm here to ask you a few questions and perform an initial assessment." Mrs. Morales nodded, wincing as she shifted in bed. "Thank you, doctor. This pain, it's been unbearable." Simone moved efficiently, taking vitals, asking detailed questions, and conducting a thorough physical examination. She noted tenderness in the right lower quadrant of the abdomen, a possible sign of appendicitis, but also some unusual symptoms that didn't quite fit the textbook presentation. "I'm going to consult with my attending physician to determine the next steps," Simone said, her tone reassuring. "In the meantime, let the nurses know if the pain worsens." Mrs. Morales nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you, Dr. Everett. You're very kind." As Simone left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the case. She reviewed the chart again, cross-referencing the patient's symptoms with similar cases she'd studied. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the issue might be more complex than a simple appendicitis diagnosis. Back on the surgical floor, Simone approached Dr. Halstead cautiously. He was reviewing a chart at the nurse's station, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Halstead," she began, her voice steady, "I've completed Mrs. Morales's intake. Her symptoms suggest possible appendicitis, but there are some inconsistencies. I'd like to request further imaging to rule out other possibilities." Halstead didn't look up. "Appendicitis is the most likely diagnosis. Schedule her for an ultrasound and let the radiologist confirm." "Yes, sir," Simone replied, biting back her frustration. She knew she couldn't push too hard, not with him, but she couldn't ignore her instincts either. As the day progressed, Simone followed up on Mrs. Morales's case, carefully monitoring her condition. When the ultrasound results came back, they confirmed her suspicion. The patient's appendix appeared normal. Simone immediately flagged the findings and requested a CT scan, despite knowing it would draw Halstead's ire. By late afternoon, the CT results were in, revealing an unexpected diagnosis: diverticulitis with a perforation. The condition required immediate surgical intervention to prevent further complications. Simone felt a surge of relief mixed with vindication. Her instincts had been right. But when she informed Halstead of the findings, his reaction was far from appreciative. "You should have brought this to my attention earlier," he snapped, his tone icy. "Wasting time on unnecessary imaging could have endangered the patient." Simone stared at him, stunned. "Sir, I flagged the inconsistencies as soon as I noticed them. The imaging was necessary to avoid a misdiagnosis." Halstead's eyes narrowed. "You overstepped your bounds, Dr. Everett. A first-year resident doesn't make those calls without consulting their attending." "But," she began, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "No buts," he interrupted. "Focus on following orders. Leave the diagnostics to those with more experience." Simone clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. She wanted to argue, to defend her actions, but she knew it would be futile. Halstead had already made up his mind. The tension in the operating room was palpable as the surgical team prepped Mrs. Morales for emergency surgery. Simone was assigned a minor role, monitoring vitals and assisting as needed. She performed her duties with precision, even as Halstead's dismissive attitude gnawed at her confidence. When the procedure concluded successfully, Simone felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. But instead of acknowledging her contributions, Halstead turned to the team and said, "Good work, everyone," his gaze pointedly skipping over her. Simone left the OR feeling deflated. She had done everything right, gone above and beyond to ensure the patient's safety, and yet she was being treated as if her efforts were insignificant. Later that evening, Simone found herself in the residence lounge, staring blankly at her laptop. The day's events replayed in her mind, each moment of dismissal and condescension cutting deeper than the last. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Evelyn entering the room until the nurse placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" Evelyn asked, her tone gentle. Simone forced a smile. "I'm fine." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You don't look fine." Simone sighed, her shoulders slumping. I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Halstead treats me like I'm invisible, or worse, like I'm a liability." Evelyn pulled up a chair, her expression serious. "You're not the first person he's done this to, Simone. He has a history of singling people out, especially residents who don't fit his mold." "Why doesn't anyone do anything about it?" Simone asked, her frustration spilling over. "Why does he get away with it?" "Because he's good at what he does," Evelyn said bluntly. "And because people like him know how to play the game. But that doesn't mean you have to let him win." Simone looked down at her hands, her resolve wavering. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Evelyn reached out, squeezing Simone's hand. "You can. You've got something Halstead doesn't. Heart. Don't let him take that away from you." Simone nodded, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. She wasn't sure how much longer she could endure Halstead's scrutiny, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't give up without a fight. As she left the lounge that night, Simone made a silent vow to herself. She would continue to push forward, not just for her own sake, but for every patient who deserved the best care possible, and for every resident who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready. She had to be. The breaking wave. The 5th day of Dr. Simone Everett's residency began with an unexpected summons to Dr. Halstead's office. She'd barely clocked in when a nurse approached her at the nurse's station, her face unreadable. "Dr. Halstead wants to see you. Now." Simone's stomach tightened. She knew this wasn't a routine meeting. Halstead rarely wasted his time on small talk. Clutching her tablet, she made her way to his office, her heart pounding with a mix of trepidation and frustration. She had spent the last 4 days being pushed, sidelined, and ignored, yet she refused to let herself be intimidated. When she entered the office, Halstead was seated behind his desk, flipping through a file with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavier. He didn't look up immediately, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "Dr. Everett," he said at last, his tone clipped. "Take a seat." Simone obeyed, her posture stiff as she waited for him to speak. He finally closed the file and removed his glasses, leaning back in his chair. "I've reviewed your actions regarding Mrs. Morellis's case," he began, his voice laced with irritation. "While the outcome was ultimately positive, your decision to request additional imaging without explicit approval was a breach of protocol." Simone fought the urge to clench her fists. "With respect, Dr. Halstead, the imaging revealed a condition that required immediate surgical intervention. Without it, the patient's life could have been at risk." Halstead's eyes narrowed. "I don't need you to lecture me on patient safety, Dr. Everett. The issue here is your inability to follow orders. As a first-year resident, your role is to assist and learn, not to make independent decisions." Simone met his gaze, her voice steady despite the fire building in her chest. "I acted in the patient's best interest. Isn't that what we're here for?" For a moment, Halstead said nothing. His expression hardened, and Simone could see the cracks in his composed demeanor. "Consider this your final warning," he said coldly. "Step out of line again, and I'll recommend your removal from this program. Do I make myself clear?" Simone nodded, her heart sinking. Crystal clear. Halstead gestured toward the door, signaling the end of the meeting. Simone stood and left without another word, the weight of his threat pressing heavily on her shoulders. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine tasks. Simone's mind raced as she worked, replaying the conversation with Halstead over and over. She knew she had done the right thing for Mrs. Morales, but the cost of her defiance was becoming increasingly apparent. Her peers avoided her, speaking in hushed tones whenever she was near, and even the nurses seemed wary of engaging with her. By lunchtime, Simone felt the strain of isolation more acutely than ever. She sat alone in the cafeteria, her tray untouched as she stared out the window. The doubt she had fought so hard to suppress was beginning to creep in. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe Halstead was right. "Mind if I join you?" A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. Simone looked up to see Evelyn, the nurse who had become her quiet ally. She nodded, grateful for the company. Evelyn sat down, placing a coffee cup in front of Simone. "You look like you could use this," Evelyn said with a small smile. "Thanks," Simone replied, wrapping her hands around the cup. Evelyn studied her for a moment. "Rough morning." Simone let out a bitter laugh. "That's putting it mildly. Halstead all but told me he's ready to kick me out of the program." Evelyn's expression darkened. "He's trying to break you. That's what he does." Simone sighed, her shoulders slumping. "And it's working." "No, it's not," Evelyn said firmly. "You're still here, aren't you? That's more than most can say." Simone nodded slowly, the nurse's words sinking in. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. That afternoon, Simone was assigned to assist in a high-stakes surgery on a VIP patient, a well-known philanthropist with a history of cardiac complications. The operation was being led by Halstead himself, with Dr. Matthews as the primary resident. Simone's role was minimal, limited to monitoring vitals and passing instruments when requested. As the surgery progressed, Simone noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. The patient's heart rhythm was becoming irregular, a subtle but dangerous shift that could indicate an impending arrhythmia. She glanced at the monitor, then at Halstead, who was focused on the delicate procedure. "Dr. Halstead," she said cautiously, "the patient's heart rhythm is showing signs of instability. Should we prepare for potential intervention?" Halstead's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Stay in your lane, Dr. Everett. I don't need you second-guessing me in the middle of a procedure." Simone hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to speak up. But Halstead's glare silenced her. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain silent as the surgery continued. Moments later, the patient's heart rate spiked, triggering a cascade of alarms. The room erupted into controlled chaos as Halstead barked orders. Trying to stabilize the patient, Simone moved quickly, assisting where she could, her hand steady despite the turmoil around her. After what felt like an eternity, the team managed to regain control. The patient's condition stabilized, and the surgery was completed successfully. But Simone couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the situation could have been avoided if Halstead had listened to her. As the surgical team filed out of the operating room, Simone lingered behind, stripping off her gloves and mask with trembling hands. Halstead approached her, his expression a mask of cold fury. "You had no business interrupting me during that procedure," he hissed. "Your job is to follow instructions, not to question my judgment." Simone met his gaze, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. "I wasn't questioning your judgment, sir. I was doing my job, monitoring the patient and reporting abnormalities." Halstead's eyes narrowed. "Don't mistake luck for competence, Dr. Everett. You're skating on thin ice." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Simone alone in the empty OR. That evening, Simone found herself in the hospital's quiet courtyard, the cool night air soothing her frayed nerves. She replayed the events of the day, wondering if she could have handled things differently. But deep down, she knew she had done what was right, for the patient, if not for herself. As she stared up at the stars, Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Evelyn. "Don't let him win. You're stronger than this." Simone smiled faintly, her resolve hardening. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Rising above the ashes, the 6th day of Dr. Simone Everett's residency at Vanguard Medical Center began with a storm brewing, not in the weather, but within the walls of the hospital. The tension that had been mounting all week now felt like it might finally break. Simone had spent the past 5 days pushing against invisible walls, enduring slights, dismissals, and outright hostility from Dr. Victor Halstead. But she also carried with her a simmering resolve that today something would change. It had to. She arrived earlier than usual, her white coat pristine, her notes meticulously organized. As she walked through the main corridor, she noticed whispers following her like a shadow. Several staff members glanced her way, their expressions unreadable. She ignored them, her focus locked on the tasks ahead. During the morning briefing, Halstead's tone was sharper than usual. He assigned cases with brisk efficiency, his words carrying the unspoken weight of his authority. "Dr. Matthews," he said, handing a chart to the ever-confident resident, "you'll assist in a robotic prostatectomy." Simone accepted the chart without comment, masking her frustration. The task was mundane compared to the challenging assignments her peers had received, but she had long since stopped expecting fairness. She would handle the job with her usual diligence, knowing that her work spoke louder than the assignments themselves. Mr. Warren was a middle-aged man in obvious discomfort, his face pale and drawn as he clutched his abdomen. Simone greeted him warmly, her professionalism unwavering. "Good morning, Mr. Warren. I'm Dr. Everett, one of the residents overseeing your care today. I'll be conducting a thorough assessment to prepare you for surgery." Mr. Warren managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Doctor. I'm in good hands, right?" Simone nodded firmly. "Absolutely. We'll take great care of you." She proceeded with the pre-op evaluation, carefully documenting his medical history and noting subtle details that might influence the surgical plan. As she worked, her instincts tingled. Something about Mr. Warren's presentation didn't align with the preliminary diagnosis of a perforated ulcer. His vitals were stable, but his pain was localized in an unusual area. "Mr. Warren," she said gently, "can you describe